The song we just sang in the garden kind of speaks maybe metaphorically or symbolically to the relationship we should have with Jesus and dwelling upon his word and having communion with him, not just the communion we have in the Lord's Supper, but just the constant heart-to-heart we have with him and through the Father and through prayer and all of those sorts of things. And I hope that our lessons here in Luke are a little piece of that larger puzzle of where we can hear the words of Jesus and have that sort of communion with him. This evening, we're going to continue our look at Luke in Luke chapter 17, where we're going to talk about the 10 lepers. And I've labeled our lesson the 10th leper because one of the 10 had some special qualities that we want to have in our life as well. So I encourage you to open your Bibles to Luke 17. We'll look through verses 11 through 19. And of course, Jesus is continuing in his travel to Jerusalem. He's announced that way back in chapter 9, and he's announced it again. He's going to announce it here again for a third time. And he's kind of on tour. He's sort of touring these areas and teaching and healing and doing all of these good things that we can learn from. So here in this area of our text, this lesson from the 10th leper, we want to get these lessons to this idea that we should seek mercy, and we should seek mercy from God. And then certainly we should obey God, in this case, obeying the words of Jesus. And as we're blessed, we need to be giving thanks. We need to be characterized by people who are giving thanks. And it's even a type of, or part of our worship of God that we give thanks. So let's jump right into our text and look here at Luke 17, 11 through 19. I'll be reading this short passage from the Legacy Standard Bible. And it happened that while he was on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing through Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, 10 leprous men who stood at a distance met him. And they raised their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And when he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And it happened that as they were going, they were cleansed. Now one of them, when he saw that he had been healed, turned back, glorifying God with a loud voice, and fell on his face at his feet, giving thanks to him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered and said, "Were there not 10 cleansed? But the 9, where are they? Was there no one found who turned back to give glory to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you." So, digging into our text here, the first part we want to think about is this idea of seeking mercy. These leprous men sought mercy from Jesus. So there in verse 11, it happened that while he was on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing through Samaria and Galilee. So we get a little bit of context here from our first verse. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is the third time mentioning that this is where he's on his way to Jerusalem, ever since chapter 9. And if we think about what he's saying here, on the way to Jerusalem and Samaria and Galilee, I get a little confused about where all this stuff is. So we have a little map here we can think about. So Samaria is this area over here on the west. Galilee is up here. And then down here is Judea, and Jerusalem is down there. So Jesus was supposed to be leaving from up here and just going to Jerusalem, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the meantime. But it sounds like he's in between Galilee and Samaria, so like over in this area where these episodes are happening. Of course, Samaria is one of those areas that is of concern because, well, those are the Samaritans, and the Jewish people look down on those people and all of that sort of thing. So let's keep that in mind for our context here. So he's on a long trip. It's not really a long trip, but he's making it a long trip through all these different things he's doing. Verse 12. And as he entered a village in that area we just looked at, 10 leprous men who stood at a distance met him. So if we think about the context of leprosy and the Old Testament laws for that, they're crying out, unclean, unclean. That's what they're supposed to do. And they're at a distance because the leprous people need to be not up against you because it's considered contagious and all of that. And so if we think about the background of leprosy, we can look at Leviticus chapter 13 to see some details on that. But just generally speaking, it's a variety of skin diseases. It seems like there's a modern malady called leprosy or Hansen's disease, and it's quite debilitating. You don't have a sense of pain, and so consequently you do things and hurt yourself and don't realize it, and you can lose your fingers and all kinds of things because you can't feel the pain. But the Bible seems to be talking about a broader set of things like eczema and things maybe just minor skin diseases. And it even talks about in some contexts where there's mold on their wall or something, and that's called leprosy. So it's a broader thing than what we would think about if we ever think about leprosy in the modern case, because that's certainly not to my awareness in America, but other places in the world. But let's look at Leviticus 13, verses 45 and 46 about the laws concerning leprosy. So as for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered. And he shall cover his mustache. I have a mustache. Cover his mustache and call it unclean, unclean. It's kind of announcing this uncleanness so other people don't make a mistake to get near you. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His place of habitation shall be outside the camp. Now, in our story, we have 10 lepers, not really alone, but they're alone from the rest of the people. They're excluded and they're separated out. So that's part of what the backdrop is when we're thinking about leprosy. It's the ceremonially unclean problem in that culture. So they're seeking mercy, right? Verse 13. And they raised their voices. These 10 leprous men raised their voices saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And this shows their faith, or at least a level of faith, that they had heard about Jesus. And they had some level of trust or expectation that he could actually do that. Because it's sort of an absurd thing to ask. There's no healing for that. You're just stuck out there away from the people. And if it gets better, then you can show the priest. But when you have it this long, you're probably just going to have it the rest of your life. But they're asking for mercy because they know about Jesus. In Luke chapter 5, and we had a situation there where someone had been healed of leprosy. And in verse 15 of chapter 5, it says the news about him was spreading. So we can just imagine that it had spread to these people. They heard, hey, there's other leprous people who've been healed. Maybe there's hope for us. Jesus can have mercy on us and give us healing. And there's a painting called The Healing of the 10 Lepers, which may or may not accurately portray everything we just read about. That's by an artist named James Tussaud, maybe. But we have the clothes torn. You can see some of that. Their clothes are all kind of shabbed and get the bandages on and all that. But is their hair covered? I don't see that their hair is covered. I don't know. And they're not covering the mustache. I don't know. They're outside. They're separated, although Jesus is getting pretty close in the picture here. So anyway, art is what it is. But thinking more about the background of leprosy, we look at Leviticus chapter 14. These folks would already know all this stuff, so we kind of maybe need to make sure we're up to speed to understand as we study through this. Leviticus chapter 14, starting in verse 2, it says, "This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing." So this is what would happen if he's able to get cleansed of this one way or another. "He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out to the outside of the camp. Thus the priest shall look, and if the infection of leprosy has been healed in the leper, then the priest shall give a command to take 2 live clean birds and a cedar wood and scarlet string and hyssop for the one who is to be cleansed." So sometimes these infections were rather short-term, and you could go back and have that checked out by the priests. So basically what you would do, if you found that you had been healed and cleansed of this, you would go to the priest, and they would look at that. They would see that, in fact, it's healed, and they would make a sacrifice as described in these verses, and then you'd be able to be brought back into the community. You'd no longer be off alone as the whole situation was before. So now we get into the obedience of these folks, and it's going to play into that background knowledge that we just looked at. These folks show some obedience. Verse 14, when Jesus saw them, he said to them, they're asking for mercy, they're asking for healing, but he doesn't, touch them and be healed. He says, go and show yourselves to the priests. Well, they can't go to the priest while they still have leprosy, right? It's kind of a leap of faith to obey Jesus here. But they do. And it happened that as they were going, they were obeying Jesus' words. They were going, even though we still have leprosy, we're going to go. They're going, then they were cleansed. So they took a leap of faith, and then they were cleansed. Even though that maybe seemed counterintuitive, they did it anyway. They obeyed Jesus, even though it didn't maybe seem, in their wisdom, the best thing to do. And they were blessed through their obedience. They were cleansed of this leprosy that had probably been with them for years. And then we see the giving of thanks, as makes perfect sense with this, but it may be a little more limited than maybe we would have expected. We look at verse 15, we see now one of them, there were 10, now one of them, when he saw that he had been healed, he turned back, glorifying God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at his feet, prostrate on the ground at Jesus' feet, giving thanks to him. So we just see this, just the one came back. But he's praising God. He's doing the right things here. He's worshiping Jesus as God. He's laying at his feet here. And even the giving of thanks, the word that's behind that is, I believe it's like 37 times used in the New Testament, and it's always giving thanks to God, giving thanks to Jesus, giving thanks to God. He's worshiping Jesus as God. So that's the right attitude. We just read through Revelation and studied through that where John worshipped an angel and was rebuked for that. You can't just worship anybody. You need to worship God. There's no rebuke here because this man is worshiping God in the form of Jesus. But who is this guy? Who is this guy? And he was a Samaritan. Now that Luke kind of holds that off until this point. We didn't know there was a Samaritan in the group, but the one guy that did the right thing, he was a Samaritan. He's the outcast of outcasts. This group of outcast lepers, they're all outcasts, but even one of those has like a double outcast. He's already an outcast because he's a Samaritan. It was kind of a surprise as we see this. We might wonder, well, so when Jesus said, show yourself to the priests, as a Samaritan, was he going to Jerusalem, or was he headed to Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritan people kind of considered their place of worship? So maybe he was by himself, and the other 9 were headed to Jerusalem, and they're kind of spreading out. And so he has this realization kind of by himself, hey, I should go thank Jesus and worship him. We see in verse 17, then Jesus answered and said, were there not 10 cleansed? There were 10. But the 9 others, where are they? The 9 others would presumably be Jewish people. That would kind of assume they all were until we were told that this one was in fact a Samaritan. Where are the 9 Jewish ex-lepers now? So we might think, application for ourselves, are we the one? Are we the 10th leper? Or are we the 9th? We have blessings from God. We have cleansing and forgiveness. But what is our reaction and attitude? Do we have that worshipful and thankful attitude that this 10th leper, this Samaritan, even back to the Good Samaritan, right? He's only the Good Samaritan because of the story that Jesus tells about it. Normally people would think of Samaritans as the bad guy. But here again, the bad guy is the hero, or at least the righteous one. He goes on in verse 18. Was there no one found who turned back to give glory to God except this foreigner? He's still going on about it. This Samaritan, this guy is the one you wouldn't expect. It's counterintuitive. We're surprised that of all people in that group, it's only this foreigner, only this Samaritan that came back. And we can have forgiveness in unexpected ways, right? The gospel is for all, including maybe that person that looks different than us, or that person that's the wrong side of the tracks, or whatever we want to say. Anybody can obey the gospel and be right with God, to become right with God. And maybe it surprises us sometimes, but we need to have open hearts to that. And what does he say here in verse 19? And he said to him, after all that thinking about how this is a foreigner, but he says to him, stand up and go. Thank you for coming and thanking me and all this, but now stand up and go. Live your life. Your faith has saved you. Now, some translations will say made him well or healed him or something like that, but it's that same word for salvation and saving that's used elsewhere. Depending on the context, we would translate that healed or saved. But, that's maybe the question for us to think about. Was he saved or was he healed? Let's think about his faith. His faith saved him. Thinking back through the story we just read, that they all sought mercy. These lepers crying out for mercy. They showed a measure of faith. They knew that Jesus could do it. And they asked. They actually took that step to reach out. And they even obeyed when maybe it was counterintuitive to do so. Go show yourself to the priest. Well, we still have leprosy. Why would we do that? They did. They obeyed. And even though they weren't healed yet, they went ahead and did that. They went. So they asked for mercy and they went. And all 10 of them did that. They were healed in the course of that. But only the 10th leper, this Samaritan, this foreigner, went a little farther. He saw that he was healed and he turned back. We might think of that relating to repentance. He's turning back. He's glorifying God with a loud voice. He fell on his face and he worshiped at the feet of Jesus. We get to see this idea of worship. He's giving thanks to Jesus as one would give thanks to God. So it seems to me that this active ingredient, this active, obedient, worshipful faith, it not only healed his leprosy, but saved him. We know that Jesus saves. Now, of course, this is all before Pentecost and everything in the Christian age here. This is Jesus before the cross and everything. He has the power on earth to forgive sins. But Jesus saved him. And there's echoes of this idea of leprosy from the Old Testament. We can think of Naaman from the Old Testament. Think about Naaman from 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. We'll read a little bit of this and summarize a little bit of this. Now, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, foreigner, okay, that's not Israel. He was a great man with his master and highly respected because by him, Yahweh had given salvation to Aram. So God was involved in this, but he's a foreigner. The man was also a mighty man of valor, a great warrior, but he was a leper. We have the leprosy thing again here. Now, in the course of that, if you read, there's an Israelite girl who was captured and became a servant to Naaman's wife. And she told the wife, here in verse 3, I wish that my master were before the prophet who is in Samaria, in the land of Israel. Then he would cure him of his leprosy. Well, that's good news. And Elisha was the prophet that was there in Samaria. He's a prophet to Israel. So this isn't really the Samaritan situation back then, but it's the same area. So Naaman hears about this, and he gets permission from his boss to go and find this prophet who can help him. He sent this king, his boss, the king, sent a letter to the king of Israel, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, and says, I'm sending Naaman, my mighty warrior, right? He knows who this is, so you can cure him of leprosy. And this king's thinking, I can't cure anybody of leprosy. He's kind of freaking out. I can't do that. Only God can do that. It's a trick. It's a trap. It's a pretext for war. So he's worried that this other foreign power who's already taken captives and everything, we're going to come in. Well, you better heal my person. If you can't do it, then we're going to take you over. That seems to be what's going on in his head. It's all a trick to have a pretext for war. So Elisha hears about this, that his king's freaking out, and he tells him to calm down and says, send him to me. I'm the prophet, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel, he says. He will know that there is a prophet in Israel. And apparently Jehoram, the king of Israel, didn't know that there was a prophet in Israel. He didn't have any trust in him anyway. Of course, he's a wicked king, so what do you expect? But down here in verse 9, so Naaman came with his horses and his chariots and stood at the doorway of the house of Elisha, the prophet. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be clean. Well, that's simple enough. Just go to the Jordan and wash, and you'll be clean. We could do that. Well, this guy didn't take it that way. He's offended. Well, he didn't even talk to me. He sent a messenger out to talk. I came all this way, I expected that, that he would call on God and he would wave his hand and voila. Then the miracle would happen. I came all this way only to be cleansed in the dirty Jordan River, and the Jordan River is dirty. We have better water at home. This is a big waste. And so that's not really the right attitude to have. That's the attitude the guy had. So his servants go to him and are like, well, this isn't really that hard. Why not you try it? What do you have to lose? So in a sense, he's like, good point. Why didn't I think of that? So he actually does. He's convinced by his servants, and he does in verse 14. So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God. Elisha had told him that. And his flesh was restored, like the flesh of a young boy, and he was clean. So a very profound miracle. It wasn't just that he was restored from the problem of the leprosy, but it took him to be such great skin like a younger person. So you might think, this God, this prophet of God, he knows what he's talking about. He's convinced now. Naaman has sort of a faith journey here. He finally obeyed God at the end of this journey, and he was cleansed and healed, we see. And then there's some goings on about he had intended to pay Elisha for this benefit, but Elisha, he isn't doing it for the money, so he's like, you don't need to pay me anything. I won't accept anything. And then in verse 17, so Naaman said, if you won't take all these gifts, if not, please let your servant at least be given, so asking for this for himself, let him be given 2 mules load of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offering, nor will he sacrifice to other gods, but to Yahweh, to the Lord, to the God of Israel. So this foreigner was converted to the worship of the Lord of Israel. And this deal with the earth, there's this cultural idea at the time that gods, there's different, the Baal of this place and that, these false gods, the concept was that they were bound to the specific land. Like even in the New Testament, Diana of the Ephesians, right? Sort of a locality goes with the name. Yahweh of Israel was sort of the way he thought of this. So, well, he thinks he needs to have the land, so he's taken the land with him so he can worship God, even though he's going back to his own area. Now that's, maybe not the right way to think of it, but that in the conception of the way people thought at the time, he was going out of his way to be able to worship the Lord, even to take the land with him. So Naaman was converted, and this Samaritan leper was converted. But are you? Are we really converted to the way we ought to be with the Lord? So, are you the 10th leper? That's really the question. Do we have that level of appropriate response to the blessings of God? Do we seek mercy the way we ought to? We saw those 10 lepers did. Do we obey even when maybe it doesn't make perfect sense to us? Do we obey anyway? Because it's not man to direct his steps, right? God's ways are higher than our ways. And when we're blessed, and maybe even when we're not blessed, are we giving thanks? We should always be giving thanks to the Lord. Do we recognize Jesus as the Son of God and as God? Emmanuel, God with us. That's the role of Jesus. So I'll leave you with verse 19. And he said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you." Will you obey God in obedient faith? Just as Naaman, even from the Old Testament, was cleansed in the Jordan, we have an echo of that we're cleansed in baptism through the blood of Christ, the atonement of Jesus died for the sins of the world. We're restored and cleansed, not of leprosy, but of sin. So if we can help you today with that, or encourage you to get right with God, if you have some things that are off track in your life, we'd like for you to be restored and cleansed, just like the idea of these lepers being cleansed. We're going to sing 263, Is Thy Heart Right with God? Well, this leper, this 10th leper's heart was right with God. Let's follow his example. If we can help you in any way, I invite you to come as we stand and sing the song together.